For instance, imagine you are planning to do research on how discussions on Facebook influences people's political views, and that you are planning to do a large-scale survey to get your data. As part of your methodological considerations, you should spell out how we might know about someone's political views, and what you mean by influence. Goods and services that mainly require low-skilled labor can be produced at a lower cost in developing countries, where such labor is abundant and, thus, cheap. Remember the term cheap labor from before, since wage levels and productivity are generally higher in the United States and other industrialized countries, it makes fiscal sense for certain goods and services. A source of some confusion is that the words method and methodology are often treated synonymously, even though they do not mean the same thing in academia. In scholarly work, methods are practical hands-on steps for doing research. This usually includes defining the scope of the research project, coming up with a research question or hypothesis. In many of the countries that fought in the world wars, there was a sudden increase in the number of boys born afterwards. The year after World War I ended, an extra 2 boys were born for every 100 girls in the UK, compared to the year before the war started. The gene, which Mr. Galatly has described in his research. The gold rushes of the 1850s made the Australian colonies world famous for mining. Gold was first discovered in New South Wales in 1823 by a public official named James McBrien, while he was on a survey mission in hills near the Fish River east of Bathurst. The gold was sparse and McBrien's record of his find was forgotten. Countries have a mutual interest in specializing in the production of the goods and services that their unique combination of labor, capital, and land will enable them to produce most efficiently and cheaply. They can then trade goods and services that they are relatively well equipped to produce for goods and services produced by other countries. The first recognized executive order was issued by President George Washington on June 8, 1789, in the form of a letter to the heads of all federal departments instructing them to impress me with a full, precise, and distinct general idea of the affairs of the United States. To determine how often teens are killed in different types of vehicles, Institute researchers compared data on fatal crashes from the Fatality Analysis Reporting System with vehicle information from the IIHS-affiliated Highway Loss Data Institute for 2013 to 2017. The data include information on the availability of front and side airbags, and electronic stability control. The mission and vision statement helps the employees to know and understand the kind of people they serve, what they serve them, and how to serve them. The mission and vision statement makes the business work more comfortable, and with this achieving, the business goals become very simple. Whereas existing exigencies demand immediate and adequate measures for the protection of the national constitution and the preservation of the national union, by the suppression of the insurrectionary combinations now existing in several states for opposing the laws of the Union, and obstructing the execution thereof. The call for volunteers hereby made and the direction for the increase of the regular army, and for the enlistment of seamen hereby given, together with the plan of organization adopted for the volunteer, and for the regular forces hereby authorized, will be submitted to Congress as soon as assembled. Epidemiology is often described as the science of public health. Here we aim to assess the extent that epidemiological methods, as covered in contemporary standard textbooks, provide tools that can assess the relative magnitude of public health problems, and can be used to help rank and assess public health priorities. Overall, it can help to see this overlap between theory and methodology, not as a problem but as an opportunity. In the example above, a good methodology discussion could pick up on earlier theory-driven considerations of what a state is, and could then seamlessly connect these to the question of what different schools of thought count as data on state behavior. Although resilience has become a popular concept in studies of poverty and vulnerability, it has been difficult to obtain a credible measure of resilience. This difficulty is because the data required to measure resilience, which involves observing household outcomes over time after every exposure to a shock, are usually unavailable in many contexts. Teens were also less likely to be driving vehicles equipped with standard side airbags and electronic stability control (ESC), and more likely to be driving models on which those features aren't even options. However, the difference between the number of teens and adults killed driving vehicles without ESC has narrowed since 2008 December. Mining has long been a cornerstone of the Australian economy, and the gold rushes were pivotal in the early development of the country. Australia is presently in the midst of yet another minerals boom, exhibited by both high prices for and record export volumes of mineral commodities, especially iron ore and coal. This follows previous minerals booms in the early 1960s and mid-1980s. It was encouraging to see the similarity between the responses to the selection characteristics, and the use characteristics. It would appear that the methodologies are actually being used to perform the tasks for which they were selected. However, later in the study it becomes clear that although these organizations are able to use the methodologies, within 10 years of the first fleet arriving in 1788, coal was discovered near Newcastle in New South Wales, and later to the south and west of the settlement. These areas provided fuel for heating and cooking, and later steam locomotion in the young colony of New South Wales. The first metal mined in Australia was lead, at Glen Osmond in South Australia in 1841. The time needed for producing full battle equipment for a 2 million-man army was rightly estimated at last, thanks to the sharp exchanges of mid-June among President, Chief of Staff, Assistant Secretary, and Mr. Knudsen, but the manner of raising the men to compose that force was not determined. Two methods, supplementary rather than alternative, had been under consideration by the army. Upon the arrival of Europeans, the Haudenosaunee attempted to establish peaceful relations with the newcomers. However, the Europeans' drive for power and control over land led to continuous warfare. The Haudenosaunee were seen as powerful allies by all Europeans, and were constantly compelled to fight for different sides. There are several different types of performance testing in most testing methodologies. For example, performance testing is measuring how a system behaves under an increasing load, both numbers of users and data volumes. Load testing is verifying that the system can operate at the required response times when subjected to its expected load. These terms have come to take on different meanings to different people, wrapped in the history and politics of the time. But what's the appropriate term? There's not a unanimous view, but some are considered more appropriate to use than others. It's helpful to understand why that's the case. Activism can be radical or moderate. Media have multiple forms, encompassing television, photography, cartoons, radio, newspapers, zines, the internet, and even the body. We use both concepts in a broad rather than narrow sense, in order to be more inclusive in selecting our entries. Pure texts tend to present a strict hierarchy of methods, with those metrics deemed to best serve etiological inquiry at the top. Extended and applied texts employ broader definitions of epidemiology, but in most cases, the metrics described are also those used in etiological inquiry, and may not be optimal for capturing the consequences and social importance of injuries and disease onsets. Australia is known as the lucky country. Though this notion was conceived as an insult to Australian culture, there is no denying that Australians, when compared to the rest of the world, possess enviable wealth. A matter of luck indeed, this wealth has been sustained, by way of virtue of the abundance of raw minerals that exist underneath the Australia. Many researchers fail to understand the distinction between standard deviation and standard error, even though they are commonly included in data analysis. While the actual calculations for standard deviation and standard error look very similar, they represent two very different, but complementary, measures. Ontario is also the nation's wealthiest province, having a substantial share of the country's natural resources, and its most mature and diversified industrial economy. It is at once Canada's economic pacemaker and a major force in national politics. Ontario is composed of two regions of widely different character, Northern and Southern Ontario. The term Aboriginal has been in the English language since at least the 19th century, formed from the 16th century term, aborigine, which means original inhabitants. It derives from the Latin words ab, from, and origine, origin, beginning. The word was used in Australia to describe the original people of the land as early as 1789. The results of this study should be viewed as an initial step in understanding the use of methodologies in today's organizations. The survey provided a snapshot of a limited set of information at one period of time. The organizations studied in the interviews may not be representative of the general community. However, these results, when combined with the results of additional studies, gene therapy is the insertion of genes into an individual's cells and tissues to treat a disease, and hereditary diseases in which a defective mutant allele is replaced with a functional one. Although the technology is still in its infancy, it has been used with some success. Acoustic phonetics is the study of the acoustic characteristics of speech, including an analysis and description of speech in terms of its physical properties, such as frequency, intensity, and duration. Descriptions of speech sounds in these terms date back as far as 1830, Willis, but the invention of the sound spectrograph, 1945, was the major technological breakthrough. While declines in U.S. hospital admissions during the onset of COVID-19 has been well documented, little is known about how admissions during the rebound varied by age, insurance coverage, and socioeconomic groups. The decline in non-COVID-19 admissions was similar across all demographic subgroups, but the partial rebound that followed shows that non-COVID-19 admissions for residents African languages appear in the written records already from ancient Egyptian times, though then only a single language, or group of languages, that is, Ancient Egyptian. Dedicated descriptive studies of other languages appear from the 17th century onwards, in northeast Africa, as well as along the coastal trade routes of European travelers. In modern Australia, gold remains a big and important element of the economy. Gold is the third-ranked export commodity for the Australian economy, only exceeded by its export of iron ore and coal. One of the ASX 200's largest companies, Newcrest Mining, is at the forefront of this. It specializes in the exploration, mining and sale of gold and gold-copper products. The breathtaking four-seasonal palette of Ontario's vast wilderness, endless forests and abundant wildlife awaits. Around 40% of Canada's population lives here for good reason. Ontario is larger than France and Spain combined. Over 250,000 lakes, including the Great Lakes bordering the US, contain a fifth of the planet's fresh water. The expression is used, though, by Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people amongst ourselves. However, many would find it offensive for a person who is not Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander to use this expression. The context of the use of this term is integral to deeming how appropriate its use may be. Artificial languages are languages that have been consciously devised, usually by a single creator. They are also sometimes called planned languages, constructed languages, or invented languages. Specific types of artificial languages may be called fictional languages, auxiliary languages, or interlanguages. At the time of the first European settlement of Australia in 1788, there were approximately 250 distinct languages spoken, representing about 28 philic families. In the early 21st century, only 20 of these languages are being learned by children. These languages are important to all areas of linguistics, as the only languages spoken by hunter-gatherers who were not in contact. The notion of activity space has been examined and applied to address various issues in geography, transportation research, social epidemiology, and environmental psychology. An activity place is generally defined as a geographic extent in which people move in the course of their daily activities. African clothing and body adornment is a complex subject that incorporates countless media and technologies, of which are in a constant state of transformation. The arts of the body are exceptionally adaptable, inherently portable, and simultaneously personal and public. Because they are mobile, moving as commodities and gifts, and worn on the bodies of travelers. Thanks to a renewed interest in medieval Hungary, in the late 20th and early 21st centuries, which can be measured by the number of exhibitions, international conferences, monographs, and study collections published by Western publishing houses, a large body of scholarship is now available on most topics in the field of medieval art in Hungary. Online catalogues of collections in museums and archives are critical resources for the study of the visual arts. There is also a section on early travelers' accounts, and a section on colonial histories and ethnographies. The second part of this article includes post-1960 studies, and is organized into 6 sections. School systems mostly define cognitive goals that either apply across multiple subject areas, for example, critical thinking, or include the acquisition of knowledge and understanding in a specific intellectual domain, for example, numeracy, literacy, science, history. Therefore, academic achievement should be considered to be a multifaceted construct that comprises different domains of learning. Accordingly, as a construct, adolescence reflects both the universal biological stage of development associated with puberty, and societal norms associated with childhood and adulthood, and the transition from one to the other. Both the biological and social processes of development take place within larger systems that are subject to change. There is a consensus that alternative schools serve students labeled at risk of education failure. These students may be either disruptive, frequently truant, involved with the juvenile justice system, judged to be failing academically, pregnant, or already parents. Active aging emerged among other semantically similar constructs, such as successful, healthy, and productive aging to express, and to promote the positive potential of older adulthood. Active aging differs from other concepts, however, because it is equally both a model of individual aging and a holistic policy approach for societies as a whole. Many of the previously available measures of adult anxiety were not validated with older populations, and those that had been validated were inadequate in certain contexts, she explains. In addition, many of the self-report tests that have been used in the past with older adults were originally designed for younger populations, and so were less than ideal in reflecting the age-specific symptoms. While the modern constellations are seen as areas of the sky used for orientation, and arranged in a grid-like map of the celestial sphere, the term is still colloquially used to refer to the visible star patterns and prominent asterisms, which are only smaller elements found in constellations. While exploring Hamilton's inner core, there are plenty of galleries and museums, big and small, to peruse. The most obvious choice is the Art Gallery of Hamilton with its collection of Canadian contemporary art, and an international collection spanning several countries and 5 centuries worth of work. Among many, one the Atlantic history's achievements has been to reconnect the metropolis to their colonial territories. There is still much work to be done, notably in France, where the scholarship has for long been divided between the ancient regime specialists and the colonial historians.